Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 2 of our 3-part series on multiple personalities with Stephen Braude, who is Professor Emeritus of the University of Maryland and former chair of the philosophy department there, Baltimore County. He is also the editor of the Journal of Scientific Exploration. In addition, he is author of many books, including First Person Plural, Multiple Personality, and the Philosophy of Mind, and other books including Immortal Remains, The Limits of Influence, The Gold Leaf Lady, and Crimes of Reason. Welcome again, Stephen.
Thank you. It seems like only minutes since I've seen you.
In fact, it has been only minutes, although for our viewers who watched part 1 of this 3-part series, it might be days or weeks. So interesting things happen with video when it comes to the nature of time itself, which would be another fascinating discussion.
Indeed.
Someday. Well, in part 1 of the series, we endeavored to define multiple personalities by looking at the history of hypnosis and the history of multiple personality disorder as a clinical entity. One of the interesting things that occurs amongst people who have this condition is that there's sometimes conflicts between the different personalities. In fact, I'm guessing more often than not.
Well, they all have their different agendas.
Mm-hmm.
Some want to be out when others would like to be out as well.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes alter identities or personalities take a dislike to others and might want to place other alters in uncomfortable or abhorrent situations.
Mm-hmm.
So one alter might put himself or herself in a sexually charged situation and then switch to another alter who abhors sex.
In other words, they can consciously leave at that point and see to it that a particular different alter emerges.
There are cases where that has happened, where one alter will destroy the valuables of another. But the most dramatic example of conflict is a phenomenon called internal homicide.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one way of dramatically demonstrating just how distinct as centers of self-awareness the alter identities or personalities can be.
Mm-hmm.
Because some alters would say they want to kill the other alters, and when it's pointed out to them that they'd be destroying the body in which they exist, they adamantly deny it.
Mm-hmm.
And some alters, in fact, would say they have different body types, different sexes from the other alters. They sometimes even report seeing the other alters in different positions in the room during therapy sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So they really do not experience themselves as the same entity as the alters they're trying to destroy.
It seems as if there's some confusion then in the mind of the alter as to the distinction between the physical body and the mental image of the body image.
Multiples vary considerably in their sophistication about what's going on with them.
Mm-hmm.
I had the good fortune of getting to know very well a multiple who even spent some time living in my house, and she spent a lot of time theorizing about what was going on with her. Mm-hmm. And trying to understand the internal structure and dynamics of the entire personality system of which she, the presenting personality, was a part.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one very interesting time in her stay at our house where we videotaped the different alters so she could actually get to know them in a way that she had never known them before. She could actually see them.
Well, it raises the question of what do we mean when we talk about human identity?
That's one of the concepts that's certainly up for grabs here, as well as the concept of a person and the concept of a personality.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I got clear about in writing about all of this was that there is no one privileged concept of a person. I mean, I think philosophers would be very quick to acknowledge that anyway, because some philosophers would say the concept of a person is fundamentally that of someone who can be held responsible for various actions, someone who can be conceived legitimately as a moral agent. Others would say that a person is fundamentally someone who, even if he or she lacks agency, for example, fetuses or basket cases or somebody like that, someone who's severely impaired, might nevertheless be regarded as a moral object, someone who deserves to be treated with compassion and respect and so on. Still, that ties the idea of a person to the idea of the person's organism. What multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder challenges is the idea that the concept of a person has to be tied in that way to the organism. We might want to think of a less organismic and more dispositional sense of person where the idea of a moral agent or a moral object is instead attached to these centers of self-awareness that you have in multiple personality.
In other words, you might have one alter who is in effect criminal.
Yes.
And you might have another alter, the same person, who is saintly.
Often the alters in a personality system come in pairs. Aggressive, passive, male, female, and so on. Yes.
It's as if one whole person is sort of dividing the functions of a single human being into multiple portions.
That's the way it seems, except the way... Well, there are a number of interesting things that go on. First of all, as personalities proliferate, it looks as if the full person's reservoir of abilities and dispositions gets distributed amongst the personality system. Now, one of the interesting things that happens in cases of multiple personality is that there can be partial integrations or even apparent full integrations, although you can never really tell.
Which would be the idea of a cure.
That's what some therapists are striving for. Others are striving just to make them functional, even if it keeps them dissociated. But what interests me is that even after partial or full, apparent full integrations, the multiple can split again, but along novel functional lines. So this is not like the way in which members of an orchestra can get different personnel, because the divisions of an orchestra remain roughly the same. You've got your percussion, strings, and winds, and so on.
Yes.
This is more like the way in which, say, a philosophy department can reorganize along different lines of specialization.
Well, the concept of reorganizing like that suggests a certain amount of mental fluidity. And it's as if, and we're getting at the really hard part about this, it's as if we really don't even understand what the mind is.
Well, I think it gives us a clue to something about the mind. And first of all, it points out the adaptational nature of alter formation. And it's one of several clues that beneath this diversity of centers of self-awareness that we have in multiple personality, behind all that, there's a kind of unifying ego that experiences the conflicts that need to be resolved, that adapts in the way that seems appropriate for the person, and monitors what's going on to make sure that the adaptations actually work, and to make sure that the divisions are successfully maintained.
A unifying ego. Well, I presume you're suggesting that's sort of hypothesized. It's not something that can be observed directly.
No, it's not observed directly. And this is analogous to a famous dispute in philosophy between, or a difference between, David Hume and Immanuel Kant on the nature of the self. Do I have the opportunity?
Yes, please.
Hume was famous for pointing out that, in his skeptical writings, that we're never directly acquainted with the self. No matter how good we think we might be at introspection, you never really find the self as an item of experience. No matter how deeply you look inside, you'll never find the thing that has your experience. You'll only find another experience. Now, that's one of the things that Kant said woke him from his dogmatic slumbers. And he actually accepted Hume's conclusion that the self is not known as an item in experience. But Kant replied that there are other ways of discovering the existence of a self. And he pointed out an interesting feature of experience. When we hear a melody, for example, or a sentence, these are items that are spread out over time,
yes,
but which we experience as coherent wholes.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't experience a sentence as a sequence of unconnected syllables or words. We don't experience a melody as a sequence of unconnected notes. We hear them as and experience them as wholes spread out over
Mm-hmm.
time. And Kant asked the question, how is the experience of a sequence possible? And his answer was, there has to be an underlying synthetic unity of consciousness to make that sequence a sequence, to experience a sequence, something that ties it all together.
Mm-hmm.
What I would suggest is that in order to understand the adaptational nature of alter formation, the proliferation of alters, the ability to maintain a dissociated state once it's erected in the first place, we have to posit similarly a unifying ego that synthesizes things not only spread out over time, but also at the same time.
Okay, that's very interesting. I can accept that. It makes sense to me, too. But let me ask you this. As I understand it, one of the points you made in your book is that no single alter ego or alter personality or subpersonality, however you wish to label it, is really complete or as whole as a normal, healthy individual. They all seem to be partial persons.
They're relatively one-dimensional, but it may take a while to figure that out. This is a tricky subject. I mean, I think most clinicians would argue that alters, no matter how much time they've had in the body to develop relations with others in the world and become more complex and full-blown, they're still relatively one-dimensional compared to at least some non-multiples. The tricky part about this is that there are plenty of non-multiples who are relatively one-dimensional as personalities,
Yeah.
who are relatively flat, uninteresting, boring.
Yeah.
And the reason multiples can go undetected for so long is that unless you're really looking for signs of one-dimensionality, it may be very easy to miss. And you may also misdescribe the switch to other alters as just other aspects of the same person, which in a sense they are.
Yeah. Well, other than the fact that there seems to be a common element of early childhood trauma, are there other social characteristics that are more common amongst multiples? For example, more female than male?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'd have to think about that.
Oh, okay. All right, well, let's look at it another way then. In terms of human identity, there are some theories in psychology. Howard Gardner is a well-known psychologist who suggests that the idea of a unified consciousness, in spite of Kant's elegant argument, is something of a myth, that we're really all just kind of a hodgepodge. In fact, some people go so far as to say even our genetics is a mixture of many different components, including non-human components. And we have vast areas of our brain. We don't know what they do, and we have two separate hemispheres that operate oftentimes independently of the other. The very notion of unified consciousness itself is under challenge, that nobody is really unified.
Well, there are different kinds of disunities. I think we have to be very careful about how we state that. The kind of Kantian argument that I just gave you would be one way of saying that we're not really just all multiples. We're not just a colony of lower order selves, each doing their own thing. Because I think when we look very closely at the nature of human abilities, we recognize that abilities are not isolable elements of a person's psyche, that in order to understand what one ability is, we have to connect it virtually to everything else the person can do.
Yes.
To understand a person's ability to, say, manage a retail store while the regular manager goes to the bank, if we explain what that ability involves, it involves a whole bunch of other tasks that the person has to be able to complete. To understand the ability to be gregarious, to understand how to respond appropriately in a conversation, a person has to draw on other capacities that are really shared among other abilities as well.
Well, that's abilities. It still doesn't speak to the whole question of individual personalities. Now you said that Kant's argument is one that implies to you that all multiples have a single unifying ego underneath, that there's a unifying consciousness. That seems to be your point of view.
Yes, even in the extreme case of multiplicity, correct.
Mm-hmm. Which would be very counter to the, as I understand the Howard Gardner argument and others who argue that human consciousness or human identity is really very fragmented all along.
I think that's actually a very careless view, because first of all, the notion of identity is very tricky.
Yeah.
I don't think there is just one thing that we mean by identity. I don't think there's just one way of taking inventories of a person. I mean, look, one of the funny things about multiple personality is that when we ask how many are there, we have different answers for different kinds of situations. Mm-hmm. You don't expect a multiple to have different driver's licenses, or to have multiple votes on election day, or to require separate social security numbers.
You don't expect that, but you pointed out to me that there are multiples where different personalities have different jobs and even different places to live.
Those are extreme cases.
Yeah.
But the reality of dealing with multiples is that there are some contexts in which we recognize a multiple as one individual deserving of a social security number, driver's license, and vote. But in day-to-day relations with the person, we might recognize that different alters require different Christmas gifts. Some you can trust with an intimacy, others not, and so on. So you have to be very careful how you treat them. In some cases, you have to treat different alters as distinct agents.
Yeah. Well, now I think what we're getting at here, if I may say so, Stephen, is the heart of your own philosophy, because, and maybe many other philosophers as well, as I understand you as a philosopher, one of the key takeaways that I get, it's that things are very situational, that there is no privileged perspective on anything that applies across the board to all situations.
It's true. That is my view.
Yeah.
That's right.
So you would be inclined to say, in general, that what the salient parameters of any situation depend on the situation.
Yes. I don't think we need to suppose that for most problems there has to be a one-size-fits-all solution. In some cases, there may be no way to decide. There are always going to be troublesome cases. There are always going to be borderline cases. And I understand the desire for simplicity, the desire for neatness, and the desire for having one final solution that'll pull everything together. It almost never works out that way.
Yeah. So you're comfortable with the notion that multiple personalities is something of an enigma. We can't really pigeonhole it one way for all time and for all purposes.
Well, I think there are things we can say about it that are accurate. I mean, I think it's perfectly accurate to say that multiple personality requires a unifying Kantian ego of some kind.
Okay.
Not necessarily a self-conscious entity in the way that an alternate personality would be self-conscious, but something that does the guiding behind the scenes, something that pulls it all together.
I know you don't feel that a multiple personality, if one part of me, let's say one of my alters, were to commit a crime, that doesn't mean that I can get off scot-free if a different alter shows up in court and has no memory or recollection or active engagement in the crime.
Well, yeah, moral responsibility or criminal responsibility in cases of multiple personality is a very tricky issue. I mean, we don't usually think that you have to Mirandize each alter, or that you need to swear in different alters when the multiple appears in court. And there are different ways of trying to figure out how do you deal with a multiple who's committed a crime of which other alters are unaware. If one alter is guilty and another's ignorant of it, what do you do? That's not an easy one to figure out. I have proposed various ways of trying to do that, but I don't underestimate the enormity of that problem.
One of the big controversies surrounding multiple personalities has to do with the whole question of memory. The fact that some multiples can remember certain events, other multiples cannot remember those very same events, even though one would think they were there at some level. And in spite of the overarching Kantian ego that you described, how can that be that the ego, the overarching Kantian ego, remembers everything, but the individual alters do not?
I'm not sure it's correct to say that the Kantian ego remembers everything, but there are many reports of so-called recorder personalities whose job it is to keep track of everything that happened. It's certainly the case that different alters seem to have selective memories of what goes on. But in a way, that part is not surprising because they have different centers of self-awareness, so it seems. And so whatever they remember will depend in part on whether they can remember things when they're not in control of the body, what they remember when they're in executive control of the body, which will always be from their perspective, and the other epistemological relations between the personalities. So some personalities might have what looks like a kind of telepathic awareness of the experiences and thoughts of other alters. It's hard to know what to make of that. I mean, you don't know whether they're really experiencing it as if from the first-person point of view of the other alter. These descriptions are very hard to unpack.
Well, it's interesting that you use the term telepathy, because we would normally think of that as, from one person to another person, but it seems to me, for the most part, we don't consider an alter the same as a person.
For the most part, we don't. But as I pointed out, there are different senses of person that we might want to invoke here. Because we do, in many circumstances, want to treat alters as distinct agents, deserving of blame or praise, or at least distinct entities deserving of respect and consideration.
It seems as if, from what you're describing, that's how they would like to be perceived.
Yes, and if you have the good fortune or misfortune, as the case may be, of being friends with or married to or otherwise living with a multiple, you recognize that you really do have to treat the alters as distinct agents and subjects. Otherwise, havoc is inevitable.
Yeah. Well, the whole field of multiple personality investigation, disorder, dissociative identity is surrounded by controversy and havoc.
Yes.
Some people try to deny that it exists at all. Other people say that it's created by the therapists or the hypnotists who are working. Other people claim that these memories of childhood trauma are very real and need to be addressed, and others say, no, these are made-up memories of early childhood traumas, perhaps satanic ritual abuse that never could have possibly occurred.
Well, you've just raised a whole pocket of issues here. As far as the reality of the altered state, I'd say it's no more tenable in the case of multiple personality than it was in the case of hypnosis. And you and I have considered how hypnotic states, at least some of them, can be regarded as paradigmatic of altered states. For example, hypnotic anesthesias. As far as some of the memories or the ostensible memories of abuse, in some cases, the abuse has been well documented. In other cases, it's not so clear. And, therapists are not detectives. It's not their job to figure out whether the abuse is real. If there was some kind of trauma that links back to some, if there's evidence from the alter that there's some trauma specificity to the alter, then there may be something in the past that has to do with it. It could also be suggested in some cases by incompetent clinicians. All those things are possible. But what we do know is that you can't simply dismiss all the cases of alter identities as being iatrogenic, caused by the clinician, or as just confabulation of some kind.
But in general, it's not thought, for example, that this is a physiological condition. It seems to be viewed as a psychological matter.
Well, I would say that, but of course, certain kinds of reductionists would want to say that, therefore, it has to be physiological in nature. That,
some way the brain is structured, for example.
Right. I mean, we know there are various physiological correlates to certain features of multiple personality disorder, But as with hypnosis, it's not clear what you take to be a control group in these cases.
What are some of those correlates?
People have noticed various changes in various kinds of brain states along with changes in personality.
I see.
But just as it's not clear in cases of hypnosis, what do you take to be a control group? Do you take actors or people simulating hypnosis? Just ordinary people doing it? The same sort of problem arises in cases of multiple personality. To whom or to what do we compare the results when we're looking at genuine multiples? Should it be someone who's accustomed to making personality switches, as actors presumably are?
Yes.
Or do we look at normal people for whom it's more of a stretch and might require or correlate with different kinds of brain states? I'd say that's an issue that hasn't been carefully resolved.
My sense is that the notion of a continuum is an important notion to think about when we look at all sorts of human behaviors. And,
yes.
For example, my mother was an actress, and so she could go back and forth to different personalities. Her great role as a community theater actress was playing Blanche in Streetcar Named Desire, a very, very powerful character, a very tragic character. But I felt that it was as if that character from time to time began to possess my mother.
I'm sure you're right that there are a number of continua here. There's even a dissociative continuum. So, there are dissociative states that aren't as dramatic as multiple personality. There are fugue states where one personality is supplanted by another, but they don't necessarily coexist. You have hypnotic hidden observer cases where through hypnotic intervention, we can cause a person not to be aware of painful procedures being conducted, but a hypnotic hidden observer can report what's going on nevertheless.
Yeah, which is sort of very close to hypnotically creating multiple identities.
It's close, but the hypnotic hidden observer doesn't have the dynamic relevance of an alter identity. It doesn't have the same kind of connections with the person's past.
Well, one of the things that we're going to look at when we get into part 3 is the relationship between multiple personality disorder and things like trance mediumship, trance channeling, other sorts of paranormal phenomenon, possession, that seem to be in some way akin to multiple personality
Certainly
disorder.
there are at least some superficial similarities, that's right.
Yeah. So we'll be taking a close look at that next.
Yes.
Stephen, thank you so much for sharing this half hour with me.
Thank you, too.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for being with us, and be sure to check your listings for part 3 of our 3-part series with Stephen Browdy on multiple personalities.